Senator Daly, you have 6 minutes.
The reason I interrupt is because I think the proposal put forward by my colleagues on this side of the House is entirely suitable and appropriate. The amendment being put down by the government is at variance to what my Senate colleague has just spoken about. The amendment says that there is no compelling evidence that this sector requires the introduction of regulations to govern the conduct of receivers. Well, as we know from the case of Paul O'Shea in Kildare, where there was Alstations and people in balaclavas, very much reminiscent of what the RIC used to do when they used to evict people 100 years ago. And this is not an isolated incident. This is what is happening now, today. A long-term solution is not a solution. And we see that when the Minister for Justice was in here bringing in the legislation regarding the mortgage arrears issues and how there was going to be insolvency agents and practitioners put in place, and they put forward proposals, the bank could veto on it. And the bank had the veto. And what has it meant? The bank vetoed. Somehow or other, asking, as Senator Mullen has said, asking banks and regulators to look towards the better angels of their human nature is at variance with what banks and receivers do. Receivers and banks make profits. They do not act in the best interest of anyone, only the laws of profit. And for my colleagues to be saying that there is no need for regulation when people are arriving at houses with balaclavas is defying the facts and the reality. And in the same way as the same colleagues opposite said there was no need to ensure that the banks didn't have a veto, and now the government are talking about taking away the bank's veto or curtailing the bank's veto in order to force the banks to do what people on this side of the House said that was necessary, people in the Irish Mortgage Holders Association said was necessary, that once you give a bank a veto, the bank will take the veto. And they have done it, and as a result, people have been evicted from their houses, and the taxpayer is footing the bill in order to find accommodation for people who have been evicted by the banks by virtue of the fact of the government giving the veto. And I note that some of the amendment is basically commending the government for its work and saying that the Land and Conveyancing Act 2009 is not a vehicle to do this and maybe another act. The Residential Tenancy Act of 2004 would be the way to do it. All of that counts for nothing, because what the government are saying, the final line, the government to keep the matter under review. This is while the guys with balaclavas are arriving at 2 o'clock in the morning. Does that sound like something that needs a long-term solution? The solution is required now. There is no regulation. The reason there was no regulation brought in 10 years ago is because there was really no need for it. Because receivers were not arriving with balaclavas. But they are arriving now. And we are going to get the reply written by the same people who probably wrote the reply for the Minister for Justice when I asked him the question, how many times did you sit down and meet with the banks about the personal insolvency legislation regarding the veto for the bank? And he would not answer the question. He would not answer how many times he met with the banks. And I said, Minister, the banks wrote the legislation. And he would not give us the information. I said, give us the minutes of those meetings that you had with the banks. Because the banks wrote the legislation that would allow them to veto solutions for mortgage holders in arrears. And what have we? Year and a half on, we have a crisis. Entirely predictable, and here it is. And let us predict another crisis. Here it is, but actually it's not predicting, it's here. They are acting like thugs, coming in the night. Not like they should, under regulations, under guidelines. Jesus, I saw a word there. It beat everything. There are guidelines. Guidelines are what they are. Guidelines. Nobody has to observe them. You can ignore them. You can tear them up. That's not good enough. There has to be consequences. People have to abide by law and regulation. This is the Wild West of taking property off people. There is no law. We were described once upon a time by one of the financial papers as being the Wild West of banking. And what happened? And that was predicted 10 years before the crash. What happened? Exactly what happens when you have no regulation. The banks did what they do. They make a profit. They all get a bonus. They all walk off with their pensions, and the taxpayer picks up the tab. What happens when you have no regulation when it comes to the issue of people taking property?
Senator Daly.
At least the RIC used to show up in daylight. But they'd knock down the house. There was law on it. It wasn't on the side of the people. But now you have no regulation. They can show up at any hour, any day, any time, and they can do what they want, aided and abetted by the Gardaí. The Gardaí observe while the mercenaries bulldoze, knock down people's doors and take people's property. And the government will keep it under review. That's going to be of great solace to those who, in the middle of the night, and if I hear one of my colleagues opposite bemoaning the fact that some of the receivers have sent in tugs and this is terrible and we should do something, the place to do it is here, and the place to do it is not in the future. The place to do it now. And yet, the government will keep it under review. I know the Minister would not be happy with some of the wording of the amendment and saying that there is no compelling evidence that this sector requires the introduction of regulation to govern the conduct of receivers. That's the amendment. We read it in the paper. There is, of course, action required now. I would ask the Minister, after he gives his response, to bring it back to his colleagues and say there is action required, and it's required now. Thank you, Cahill.